Wix Studio, one end-to-end web creation platform for your agency to deliver exceptional work with absolute efficiency.
The #1 long-form writer that helps SEOs outrank competition at the click of a button using real-time research and NLP. Start ranking content today with content@scale.ai.
Schema is a word I'm going to be using a lot throughout this talk. We're going to talk about schema a lot here. And first and foremost, how many of you use schema markup on your websites? Show of hands. OK, that's more than I would have thought. Great. Cool. So fundamentally, just under half of websites actually use schema markup on their site. So if we take a look at the study that was from last year's Web Almanac, so the SEO chapter, I co-wrote it with Sophie Brannan and Mordy Oberstein, we found that just under half of sites actually used schema markup, which is sort of a trend going up we've seen over the past few years. But it's good to see that this is continuing to go up. And the question really is, why is it important and why should you care? Well, fundamentally, from Google's perspective, a lot's been happening. So if we take a look at how Google is continuing to verify information. So from March of 2023, you may remember about this author was introduced on the SERP. So on the SERP, you've got a little panel. You can see who actually wrote the content. And this is important because Google wants to understand that there are real people writing this content. And so I'm going to link this towards schema, of course, because schema markup essentially supports EEAT, because schema is code that describes code. So it's very important so that Google can understand more about the context of what's on your page and on your website. So speaking of EEAT, here's just a bit about me. So I'm the Senior SEO Director at StudioHawk, a specialist SEO agency. We've got an office in London. We've got a couple of offices over in Australia. I'm the host of the SEO Unplugged podcast, so I've interviewed some fantastic people, had great conversations from the likes of Google, SEMrush, Wix, and I've written a book called Keywords for SEO. So that's the EAT bit about me out the way. So what we're going to be covering today is what makes schema complex. We're going to look into some useful B2B and B2C schema. Then we're going to look into more practical things of how you can generate, debug, and scale schema markup using AI. And then we'll look into how you can implement it with Google Tag Manager. So let's begin. First and foremost, what makes schema complex, right? So obviously, this is my own subjective interpretation, but for context, schema.org contains 803 types and 1,465 properties. So that's a lot of types, that's a lot of properties, right? And so the way it works is that every single schema type, so the schema is a set of types, and each of these types have properties that are associated with them. Right? So that's just a bit of context there. And the way that I describe schema being complex is essentially using specific types and properties that will reinforce EEAT, so things that Google will actually care to look out for in terms of how you're describing what's on your page. So let's first look at an example of organization schema. You guys, I'm sure, are familiar with organization schema. It's one of the most common schema types that's used. But let's take a look at an example here. So, perfectly valid organization schema of the Unlimited Ball Bearings Corp, where we've got the URL, which is not their real URL, so don't try and look that up. And we've got the type there, so contact point, the telephone number, how you can get in touch, right? So, what do you reckon? Is this good? Good? Bad? I mean, it's perfectly valid, right? But what if I told you that out of the 70 possible properties that exist under organization schema, this example only used 4? Which is about 5%, right? So what that tells me is, and Google, is that's quite basic, right? There's really not much there. And this is very common. I see loads of examples like this, but I don't know what the Unlimited Ball Bearing Corp actually is. But anyway, just an example. So fundamentally, limited info in schema isn't good. We want to be providing as much context as possible, right? So have you ever heard of the phrase less is more? Well, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that goes out the window when it comes to schema markup, because how can less be more? That's impossible. More is more, right? And this guy's a crazy Swedish guitarist, by the way, if you don't know. But anyway, We want to provide more context, right? And the problem, bless you, the problem that we have is that many CMS platforms and plugins and apps, they provide limited schema out of the box with not much flexibility, not much customization, which is a problem, right? And even organization schema, sorry to tell you, but it's really generic. So if you're using it, there's a good chance that you could be using a different schema type that's more specific to your use case and your business. So with schema and schema types, you can find more specific types. So the way that you do that, if you're looking at organization schema, for example, on schema.org, scroll all the way down, you'll find more specific types there at the bottom. Now, this won't happen for all of them, but with a lot of different types of schema, you can see more specific types. So that's just good practice for you to sort of look and dig deeper into this. And the search function also on schema.org is very underrated. So for example, if I am an e-commerce site and I've got no idea what kind of schema types I want to use, I can go on the search bar, put e-commerce. What's the first thing that shows up? Online store, which is a schema type that's more specific than organization, but it's even more specific than online business because you've got organization schema, a more specific type would be online business, and then an even more specific type would be online store, which is perfect for e-commerce sites. So if you're an e-commerce site and you're using organization schema, consider switching it up to online store. Just a little tip. So what you want to do essentially is once you've found the schemas that you want to use, you want to look through all of the relevant properties that Google would essentially find helpful. So that would enforce EEAT again, right? And then at that point, you pretty much want to have all the values of these property ready to fill out. So it's almost like a shopping list, right? So if, for example, I want to create recipe schema, I'm going to specify exactly what nutrition, I want to specify the cook time, the cooking instructions. So I'm going to have the properties, and then I'm going to fill out the values so that they're ready, right? So that's the practice you should do. But you might be too busy, right? Which, everyone's busy nowadays, right? So don't worry, I got you. So we're going to look into useful B2B and B2C schema. So get ready for a super cool Venn diagram that you might want to take a picture of. But what you might notice is that most of these schema types I've put in the middle because they're actually applicable across both B2B and B2C instances. So things like website, web page, you can do that for any type of website, any type of business. The ones that typically I find are more commonly used within B2B is schema like service and event. And on the B2C front, let's say if you're an e-com, you might have product schema, you might have collection page schema. But all of these are very valid in the middle that you can use across all sorts of websites. So if you're not using them and there is an opportunity for you to use them, then I would highly recommend that you do so. And the thing with these properties, right, and these schema types, so EEAT-rich properties, like I said, is properties that Google might find helpful. So a lot of those types that I showed you before, they contain EEAT-rich properties. So let's look at some examples. The about property essentially allows you to provide context of the subject matter. And then what you can do with this is you can pair this with the same as property, essentially to link about how you reference what that thing is about to other types of authoritative sites. So there was mentions of Wikipedia earlier. You can also use Wikidata, which is another type of network graph that Google likes to use. Social media sites can work as well if you're sort of referring to a person, but all of these can work with same as, and for the SEOs out there, this is pretty self-explanatory, right? Keywords. You can use that as well, EEAT-rich properties. So, more practical stuff. Let's look into now how we can generate, debug, and scale schema markup using our good friend ChatGPT. So, open ChatGPT, but wait, hold your horses, right? We need to think of a concept called GIGO. Has anyone heard of GIGO? Yeah, maybe 2 people. All right, anyway, GIGO stands for garbage in, garbage out. And what this essentially refers to is your prompts in this scenario. With ChatGPT, if you have low quality prompts, you are fundamentally going to generate low quality outputs. So this is where most people seem to struggle when it comes to using the likes of ChatGPT, is a lot of it's to do with the prompts and not necessarily how good the model or how good the AI actually is. So bear that in mind. I'm not throwing shade at anyone, but just saying prompts are very important. So if you want to avoid crappy prompts, you have to have very well-defined use cases in terms of what it is that you're trying to get out of AI. So for our case, when it comes to schema markup, we're going to be looking into certain prompts that are going to relate to either getting ideas of schema types and properties. So if you, let's say, don't have a clue about what it is you're trying to generate, you can use ChatGPT to get ideas of what you might want to use. You could also use it to generate schema based on predetermined values. So the example I gave before of like recipe schema where you set all the values and the properties, that's predetermined values. So you could use those to help generate schema. And then you can also use AI, ChatGPT, to essentially scale this up and also to fix incorrect code. So let's look at an example here of how we can generate schema. So an example prompt that you might want to use is generate recipe schema markup using JSON-LD with the following properties and their values. So what we've got here, we've got a bunch of properties, and then a colon, and then the values we want to use. So I don't actually know how to bake chocolate chip cookies, so don't take this literally, but we've got a bunch of the properties and their values there. The last thing I put is don't forget to include the opening and closing JSON-LD script tag. So something with schema that's very important is that you actually include the opening and closing tags. Otherwise, your schema won't actually work. And with ChatGPT, if you don't specify this, most of the time it won't actually give you those tags. So that's why I've specified that in there. So like I said, this prompt is using predetermined values. It's values we've already written down and we're using to generate schema. So once we do this, this is the output that we got. And this, very, very good, right? Perfect, nothing wrong with it. So it's given me the opening and closing script tags. It's given me exactly the type of schema that I wanted to use, which is recipe. It's put all of the right properties in there and all of the right values that I've included. But the first thing you should do really when you get the output is copy the code and put it into the schema.org validator. So you paste the code in because you want to check for errors, because sometimes errors do happen. So you always want to check with the validator. So I've done that here, and it was fine. There was no problems with it at all, right? Which is great. And if there are problems, what you do want to do is go back to ChatGPT and put fix this schema, colon, put a line break, and just paste the value that was incorrect. And then most of the time, it will actually fix it and get it right. So that's how you would sort of fix it if it isn't working correctly and you do get errors. But the question is, how can you scale this? And the good news is you can scale it. The bad news is that it took me a while to figure out how to do this properly. But it's fine. Don't worry about it. I went through all the crap, so you can do this. So what you want to do, you want to create a spreadsheet that has different tabs. And each tab is essentially going to represent a different type of schema code that you're trying to generate. So this is using Google Sheets. So I've basically got two tabs here because I've had enough of making just chocolate chip cookies. I want a recipe schema for chocolate or whatever, I don't know. So those two examples, we've got different types of properties, different types of values. So we've got that in a spreadsheet. So it doesn't matter if you use Google Sheets, Excel, whatever you like to use, numbers, whatever. But the most important thing here is that you export the spreadsheet as a .xlsx file, which is an Excel file. Because if you try and export it as a CSV, it won't work. If you export it as a numbers file, it won't work. Make sure it's this file. And the other thing that you'll need is a premium ChatGPT subscription, which isn't that expensive, but I just use the StudioHawks account because I don't want to pay for my own personally, but hey-ho, still works. So you're going to need ChatGPT Premium to do this, right? So with ChatGPT, you're going to use GPT-4, and you're going to select the Advanced Data Analysis option. Then in the bottom where you put in your prompts, you're going to have the upload file, so the little plus on the left-hand side. So you want to upload that spreadsheet that you exported out, and you want to put it there. And this is the kind of prompt that you're going to want to use. So this has worked for me. So basically, we're saying there's multiple tabs in this file. The first column contains the properties. The second one contains the values. And essentially, again, generate recipe schema separately for each of the tabs using JSON-LD, making sure to include the opening, closing JSON-LD script. Sorry, it's a long prompt, but you have to be very specific, right? And then I said, only use the data in the tabs and do not add any other properties, because what ChatGPT does sometimes, which is really frustrating, is it will just randomly just add other properties. Some of them don't even exist. So you want to tell it to not do that. And then make sure that each tab has its own schema generated with the reference properties and values. So that's a sort of prompt that you could use to do this with the spreadsheet, and this is the sort of output that it gave. So it definitely did provide me with multiple types of code there, which is great, but it did have a slight issue, I don't know if you noticed, but with the same as, because I had two values within the same column, it actually literally put the text that I had in there. So this is one of the things where you've got to experiment with it. So if you're using multiple, say, values within one individual column, maybe add another column and then redo the prompt. So you can see that it's not perfect, but for the most part, if you specify everything and have, say, one or two columns, one for the properties, one for the values, and only have one value within that column, it should be fine, right? And don't worry, I'll share a QR code a bit later that has sort of more prompts that you can use across all different use cases with more context as well. So now that you have your schema, right, it's all well and good, but we need to push it live. And the way we're going to do that is using our friend, Google Tag Manager. So implementing schema with Google Tag Manager. It's actually really simple. So if you don't do this, you should. So GTM is the GOAT, as far as I'm concerned, for multiple reasons. The first one is that it's free, which is great. You don't need to pay for it. The second one is it doesn't require CMS access to implement the schema. So you may have dealt with a lot of clients or business owners who are very, very protective over their CMS. They don't want to provide you with access. You don't need access to the CMS because you just need the GTM code installed and then you can use it already, right? The last one is that it's easy to update anything if things go wrong, and you won't really break anything. Because of the way Google Tag Manager works, you're not really doing stuff on the back end of the site. It's just code that gets added onto the page. So if anything does sort of need to change, you can change it very easily and the site won't go down, right? So GTM is the GOAT. The only problem with GTM is that it's not efficient for dynamic schema. So this is where you might want to change the values or change the properties of your schema over time, especially if you do this frequently, like if we're doing schema about stocks and the price of stocks and how that changes very frequently. It wouldn't be good for this use case, right? But for the most part, it's great. And if you cannot get GTM access, you need to bonk the client or the dev that isn't giving you GTM access, because there's no reason why they wouldn't give you GTM access, and you can tell I'm frustrated because I've been in those conversations before. Rip Cheems, by the way. He's in meme heaven now. Yeah. But anyway, open Google Tag Manager, and then what you're going to want to do is obviously making sure that you can add tags and triggers. You want to go to tags on the left-hand side. You're going to want to click on New at the top right there. You can see it hovering around. First things first, you want to rename the tag to something called My Schema or whatever. Tag configuration, click Custom HTML, paste your schema there, make sure it's got the opening and closing script tags in there, and that's step one done. So you've made the tag, now we need to add the trigger. To add the trigger, you want to click on the plus on the top right. You want to call it something. Then you want to click on the configuration page view. We're going to do some page views where page URL contains blog. So I'll slow down. I'm just trying to get it in time with the GIF here. But essentially, with your schema, if you want it to appear on all pages, you can specify it to be page views and then all page views. But for this instance, I wanted to put page URL contains blog because I only wanted that schema to show up when I'm on a page on my site that contains blog, right? So then you want to save the tag and the trigger and click on Preview. And this is the point where you're going to put your website in so that it can connect up, and then you can see if your tags are firing or not firing. So when I put that onto the homepage, we can see that under the tags not fired bit, my schema, which is the new one I made, is not firing. But then when I went onto the blog page, it did fire there, and you can see it fired one time there. So that's essentially how you do it. But this is where a lot of people kind of forget to actually push it live. So remember, you need to click Submit, and then you need to click Publish, because otherwise you're just going to be like, yeah, I did this, and then client's like, well, what do you mean? So yeah, always make sure you submit after you preview and actually publish these changes. But once you've done that, then you're golden. Now, if you do want to scan this QR code here, it's going to provide a blog post which just has a bit more prompts that you can use, a bit more context. So I'd recommend reading through it fully because it is quite useful, and it took me a while to sort of go through stuff. But whilst you got your phones out, I'm going to take a little selfie with you guys because you guys are cool. All right, sweet. And I think we're done with that. So thank you very much for attending the talk. I hope you found it useful and really appreciate your time.
Monthly reporting making you want to shove sharp things up your nose? Try Dragon Metrics, the all-in-one SEO software with mind-blowing reporting tools.